May 17, 1945. The air smells of burnt diesel and wet concrete. In the broken remnants of a chemical research facility outside Munich, a man in a wrinkled grey suit stands before 3 American officers. His hands tremble slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Behind him, filing cabinets lie overturned, their contents scattered like autumn leaves across the floor. The man's name is Dr. Friedrich Weber, and 2 weeks ago, he wore the uniform of the SS today. He wears the careful expression of a man negotiating for his life. The Americans ask him about rocket fuel formulas. He answers in flawless English, his voice steady, clinical. Outside, through the shattered windows, the spring sun illuminates the rubble of the Third Reich. The war in Europe has been over for 9 days. The competition for its secrets has only just begun. This was not an isolated moment. Across the shattered landscape of defeated Germany, in laboratories and offices, in prison cells and makeshift interrogation rooms, similar scenes unfolded with startling frequency. The United States, victorious but anxious, was conducting one of the most morally complex operations in modern history, the systematic recruitment of Nazi scientists, intelligence officers, and technical specialists. They called it Operation Paperclip, though that sanitized name concealed a profound ethical compromise. By the end of 1945, hundreds of former Nazis were already working for the American government. Within a decade, that number would swell into the thousands. The price of their expertise was simple: betray the Reich that had fallen, and serve the democracy that had destroyed it. Help us, and we will help you forget. The origins of this Faustian bargain lay not in mercy, but in fear. Even as American soldiers liberated concentration camps and witnessed firsthand the industrial machinery of genocide, even as the Nuremberg trials prepared to prosecute the architects of Nazi atrocities, another calculation was taking place in Washington and London. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union was fracturing. Stalin's Red Army occupied half of Europe. American intelligence reports painted an alarming picture. Soviet scientists were already scouring the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, extracting technical expertise with ruthless efficiency. The Germans had developed revolutionary technologies: jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, nerve agents, infrared optics, advanced submarines. In May 1945, these technologies represented the cutting edge of military science. Whoever controlled them would dominate the coming peace. The Americans understood that they were not simply occupying a defeated enemy. They were standing in the ruins of a dark empire that had, paradoxically, pushed the boundaries of human knowledge even as it plumbed the depths of human evil. The German scientists understood this leverage with remarkable clarity. They had expected annihilation, war crimes, trials, perhaps summary execution. The Third Reich had waged a war of extermination across Europe. Its scientists had often been willing participants, conducting experiments in concentration camps, developing weapons specifically designed for terror, supporting a regime that had murdered millions. Many had joined the Nazi Party not out of ideological fervor but out of professional necessity. Party membership had been required for career advancement in German academia and industry after 1933. Others had been true believers, convinced that National Socialism represented humanity's future. But by May 1945, ideology had become a luxury no one could afford. The scientists had expected judgment. Instead, they received job offers. Werner von Braun understood this transformation better than most. On May 2, 1945, von Braun and his team of rocket scientists surrendered to American forces in the Bavarian Alps. Von Braun was 33 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and deeply compromised. He had been the technical director of the V-2 rocket program, the world's first long-range ballistic missile. The V-2 was a marvel of engineering, a liquid-fueled rocket that could deliver a 1-ton warhead across 200 miles, reaching the edge of space in its arc. It was also a weapon of terror. Over 3,000 V-2 South had been launched against Allied cities, killing an estimated 9,000 civilians, most of them in London and Antwerp. But the human cost extended far beyond the missile's targets. The V-2 South had been built by slave laborers in underground factories, primarily at a facility called Mittel. More than 20,000 prisoners died in those tunnels, worked to death or executed more casualties than the missiles themselves would inflict. Von Braun had visited the factories. He had seen the conditions. He had said nothing. When von Braun met his American captors, he did not grovel. He negotiated. He had something the Americans desperately wanted: the future of missile warfare. The United States Army was still launching artillery shells in parabolic arcs and dropping bombs from propeller aircraft. Von Braun offered them weapons that could strike from space itself, that could cross oceans in minutes, that could render traditional warfare obsolete. He understood that his value lay not in past achievements, but in future possibilities. The Americans asked about his Nazi Party membership, about his SS rank. He had been an officer, though he would later claim it was ceremonial, a political necessity. Von Braun answered carefully, minimizing, explaining. He portrayed himself as a scientist who had served his country, not a Nazi who had enabled genocide. It was a performance, but it was convincing. Within months, von Braun and more than 100 of his colleagues were on their way to the United States, their Nazi pasts carefully scrubbed from official records, the pattern repeated across occupied Germany. In the weeks and months following the German surrender, American intelligence teams fanned out across the country, armed with target lists and recruitment quotas. They called themselves T-Forces, Technical Forces, and their mission was explicit: find the scientists, secure the technology, deny it to the Soviets. They competed with British and French teams engaged in similar operations, and they raced against Soviet intelligence officers who were conducting parallel extractions in the eastern zones. The Americans had one advantage: they could offer something the Soviets could not. They could offer reinvention. A German scientist recruited by the Soviets would work in isolation, probably in Siberia, under constant surveillance, forever marked as a former enemy. A German scientist recruited by the Americans could become an American, could build a new life in a new world, could transform from war criminal to Cold War asset. All they had to do was help. Dr. Kurt Blome learned this lesson with stark clarity. Blome had been the deputy Reich health leader and plenipotentiary for cancer research in the Nazi government. He had also overseen biological warfare research, including experiments on concentration camp prisoners involving plague, typhus, and other diseases. In 1947, Blome stood trial at Nuremberg as part of the doctor's trial, accused of conducting criminal medical experiments. He was acquitted not because the evidence against him was weak, but because his defense successfully argued that his research had been theoretical rather than applied. The verdict was legally defensible but morally dubious. What happened next was neither. Within 2 years of his acquittal, the United States Army Chemical Corps recruited Blome to work on chemical and biological warfare projects. His expertise in bioweapons, developed through experiments on human subjects, was deemed too valuable to waste on moral qualms. The logic was coldly pragmatic. If we don't recruit him, the Soviets will. Better that his knowledge served democracy than tyranny. The fact that it had previously served fascism seemed somehow less relevant. That this moral calculus infected every level of Operation Paperclip. American officials were not naive about whom they were recruiting. Military intelligence reports documented Nazi Party affiliations, SS memberships, and participation in war crimes, but the directives from Washington were clear. National security took precedence over denial. In September 1946, President Truman formally authorized the program, with the explicit stipulation that no ardent Nazis should be recruited. The definition of ardent proved conveniently flexible. Joint intelligence objectives, agency officers, tasked with vetting candidates, began systematically whitewashing personnel files, removing or minimizing evidence of Nazi activities. It was a bureaucratic conspiracy conducted through paperwork and omission. A scientist who had joined the Nazi Party in 1933, a potential sign of ideological commitment, would have his file rewritten to suggest he had joined in 1940, under duress. An SS officer's rank would be described as honorary. Forced labor in weapons factories would be recast as ordinary industrial production. The paperclip that gave the operation its name was literal. A paperclip attached to the sanitized files to distinguish them from standard immigration applications. It was a small, mundane object, a symbol of bureaucratic efficiency. It held together lies. The scientists who accepted American recruitment found themselves in a strange new world. They had expected rubble and occupation, but they encountered abundance. The contrast was overwhelming. Germany in 1945 was a landscape of apocalyptic destruction. Cities were fields of rubble. Food was scarce. Fuel, clothing, medicine, all the basic necessities of life were rationed or unavailable. The German people survived on an average of 1,500 calories per day, barely sufficient to sustain basic metabolic functions. Starvation was common. Disease was rampant. And then the scientists arrived in America. They were housed in military facilities, fed from army commissaries, provided with salaries that exceeded what most Americans earned. They ate meat, butter, and fresh vegetables. foods that had become distant memories in wartime Germany. Their children attended American schools. Their wives shopped in stores filled with goods. It was not just abundance, it was a different order of reality. The philosopher Hannah Arendt would later write about the banality of evil, about how ordinary people could participate in extraordinary atrocities. Operation Paperclip revealed the banality of redemption, how atrocity could be forgotten, how complicity could be erased, simply by crossing an ocean and filling out the right forms. The symbolic weight of food cannot be overstated. To the German scientists, American abundance was not merely material comfort, it was ideological proof. They had been raised in a culture of scarcity, had served a regime obsessed with Lebensraum living space. The idea that Germany needed to conquer territory to feed its people. The Nazis had waged a war of extermination in Eastern Europe, partially to secure grain supplies. Millions had starved in deliberate famines, and now these scientists sat in American cafeterias confronted with waste, with excess, with the casual discard of food that would have kept a German family alive for days. It was propaganda more powerful than any speech. It said, "We won not because we were more ruthless, but because we were more productive. Our system works. Yours failed." The scientists, pragmatic men who dealt in equations and evidence, accepted this lesson. They had believed in National Socialism's promises of efficiency, of national greatness, of historical destiny. Those promises had ended in rubble and surrender. American capitalism made no grand promises, it simply delivered. For men accustomed to thinking in terms of results, this was a compelling argument, yet the transition was not seamless. The scientists carried their pasts like shadows. They worked in American facilities, lived in American towns, sent their children to American schools, but they remained German, at least in the privacy of their homes. They spoke German to each other, celebrated German holidays, and maintained German cultural traditions. Some genuinely embraced their new country, grateful for the second chance. Others remained internally loyal to ideas they could no longer voice publicly. And many existed in a state of cognitive dissonance, simultaneously accepting American generosity while minimizing or denying their own complicity in Nazi crimes. When confronted with evidence of concentration camps, of gas chambers, of the industrial machinery of genocide, many claimed ignorance. They had been scientists, they insisted, focused on technical problems, insulated from political decisions. It was a convenient fiction, but one that Americans were often willing to accept. The alternative, acknowledging that they were employing men who had enabled mass murder, was too uncomfortable, too compromising America's moral self-image as liberator and champion of freedom. The case of Arthur Rudolph illustrates the depth of this compromise. Rudolph had been the production director at Mittelbau-Dora, the underground factory where V-2 rockets were built by slave labor. He was directly responsible for production quotas, which meant he was directly responsible for the brutal conditions that killed thousands. After the war, Rudolph was recruited by the United States and became a key figure in America's space program. He worked at NASA for decades, eventually directing the Saturn V rocket program that put men on the moon. In 1969, Rudolph received the Distinguished Service Medal, one of NASA's highest honors. It was not until the 1980s, after an investigation by the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, that Rudolph's past was fully exposed. Faced with potential prosecution, he agreed to relinquish his American citizenship and leave the country. He returned to Germany, bitter and defiant. In interviews, he never expressed remorse for the deaths at Mittelbau. He characterized the slave laborers as saboteurs who had to be controlled. He portrayed himself as a victim of post-war persecution. The cognitive dissonance was complete. A man who had presided over a death factory saw himself as a patriot and a scapegoat, unable or unwilling to recognize the moral gravity of his actions. Not all the recruited scientists were engineers or physicists. Operation Paperclip also targeted intelligence specialists, particularly those with expertise in Soviet affairs. The logic was straightforward. Nazi Germany had waged a brutal war against the Soviet Union, gathering extensive intelligence in the process. That intelligence, knowledge of Soviet military capabilities, understanding of Soviet strategy, networks of informants and agents, was too valuable to discard. Reinhard Gehlen was perhaps the most significant of these recruits. As head of foreign armies east of Wehrmacht's military intelligence service on the Eastern Front, Gehlen had compiled massive files on Soviet forces. As Germany collapsed, Gehlen made a calculated decision. He ordered his archives microfilmed and hidden in the Bavarian Alps. Then he surrendered to the Americans and offered a deal: his intelligence network in exchange for protection and employment. The Americans accepted. By 1946, the Gehlen organization was operating as a de facto American intelligence service in Germany, employing former Wehrmacht and SS intelligence officers, conducting espionage against the Soviet Union. In 1956, it was formally transferred to West German control and became the West Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service. Gehlen served as its director until 1968. The continuity was remarkable. Men who had served Hitler's intelligence apparatus seamlessly transitioned to serving American and then West German intelligence, their skills and networks preserved, their pasts quietly forgotten. This pattern of continuity extended beyond intelligence services. In West Germany itself, denazification of the Allied program to remove Nazi officials from positions of power was increasingly abandoned as Cold War tensions escalated. By the late 1940s, West German industry, government, and the judiciary were staffed with former Nazis, often in positions similar to those they had held under Hitler. The reasoning was pragmatic. Germany needed functional institutions, and the men with administrative experience were the same men who had run the Nazi state. Americans convinced themselves that these were good Germans who had been coerced into party membership, who had served their country rather than an ideology. It was a convenient narrative, though one that ignored the enthusiastic participation of many in the Nazi project. Operation Paperclip was not an anomaly, but part of a broader pattern. The Western Allies prioritized anti-communism over anti-fascism, pragmatism over justice. The scientists themselves developed sophisticated justifications for their choices. They argued that science was apolitical, that technical knowledge could serve any master. They claimed they had been powerless, that refusal would have meant imprisonment or death, an argument that was sometimes true but often exaggerated. They emphasized that they had never personally killed anyone, that they had been distant from the camps and the gas chambers, that their hands were clean even if the regime they served was not. These justifications allowed them to sleep at night, to look at themselves in mirrors, to tell their children they had done nothing wrong. But the justifications were hollow. Science is never apolitical. The decision of what to research, how to apply knowledge, whom to serve, these are profoundly political and moral choices. The V2 scientists knew their rockets were being built by slaves. They toured the factories. They saw the conditions. They said nothing because speaking out would have cost them their careers, perhaps their lives, and they valued their work more than the lives of the prisoners. That calculus was not apolitical. It was a moral choice, and they made it consciously. American officials made their own moral calculations. They told themselves they were preventing a greater evil, that Soviet acquisition of Nazi technology would tilt the balance of power dangerously. They argued that the scientists would work for someone, so better for America than for Stalin. They convinced themselves that the scientists were not real Nazis, not the architects of genocide, just technicians who had kept their heads down. These rationalizations were not entirely false, but they were incomplete. They ignored the victims, the 20,000 who died building V2 rockets, the prisoners experimented upon, the millions murdered by the regime these scientists had served. Justice would have demanded prosecution, accountability, punishment. Instead, there was employment, citizenship, and comfortable lives. The message was clear: if you have valuable skills, if you can help us, your past can be forgiven, your crimes forgotten. It was a dangerous precedent, one that would echo through subsequent American foreign policy. In the decades that followed, the United States would support authoritarian regimes, would train death squads, would overlook human rights abuses, all in the name of Cold War pragmatism. Operation Paperclip was an early chapter in that story, a moment when moral clarity was sacrificed for strategic advantage. Yet not everyone accepted this bargain quietly. Within the American government, some officials objected. The State Department raised concerns about the ethics of recruiting Nazis. Jewish advocacy groups protested. Labor unions argued that importing German scientists would cost American jobs, but these objections were overruled. The military and intelligence establishments argued that national security transcended other considerations. The Soviet threat was real, immediate, and existential. Whatever the moral costs, America could not afford to lose the technological competition. This argument carried the day, not because it was right, but because it was expedient. The officials who made these decisions were not monsters. They were ordinary men, doing what they believed was necessary to protect their country. That ordinariness is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the story. Evil does not require malice. It requires only the conviction that the ends justify the means. that morality is a luxury that can be set aside when circumstances demand it. The impact of Operation Paperclip extended far beyond the individuals recruited. The program fundamentally shaped the trajectory of post-war American science and technology. The space program, which would become a defining achievement of American ingenuity and a symbol of democratic superiority, was built on a foundation laid by Nazi engineers. The intercontinental ballistic missiles that formed the backbone of American nuclear deterrence were direct descendants of the V-2. Developed by the same teams, American jet aircraft incorporated German aerodynamic research. Chemical warfare capabilities were enhanced by Nazi expertise. Even medical research benefited. Though this legacy is more troubling, some of the data came from experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners, raising profound questions about whether such knowledge should be used at all, regardless of its source. The scientists themselves became Americans, indistinguishable from their native-born colleagues. Their children were Americans. Their grandchildren are Americans. The past was buried, but it did not disappear. It became part of the foundation on which the future was built. In the 1960s, as the civil rights movement challenged America to confront its own hypocrisies and moral failures, Operation Paperclip remained largely unknown to the public. The files were classified. The scientists maintained their silence. It was not until the 1970s, in the aftermath of Watergate and the Vietnam War, that investigative journalists and historians began to excavate the story. What they found was disturbing. Not a few isolated cases of pragmatic compromise, but a systematic program of moral evasion. The revelations sparked debate. Some argued that Operation Paperclip had been necessary, that the Soviet Union was a genuine threat, and that America had been right to use whatever tools were available. Others condemned the program as a betrayal of the principles for which World War II had been fought, a cynical embrace of the very evil America had claimed to oppose. The debate continues unresolved. Perhaps it cannot be resolved. Perhaps the point is not to reach a conclusion but to grapple with the complexity, to acknowledge that history is not a morality play with clear heroes and villains, but a series of difficult choices made by fallible people in ambiguous circumstances. The scientists themselves, those who lived long enough to see their pasts exposed, reacted in varied ways. Some, like Werner von Braun, maintained a carefully constructed narrative of innocent service, of science for its own sake, of regret for the suffering caused by the war but no personal responsibility for it. Von Braun gave interviews in which he expressed sorrow for the deaths at Mittelbau-Dora but insisted he had been powerless to stop it, that he had been focused on technical problems, that he had not understood the full extent of the horrors. It was a performance, polished over decades, designed to preserve his reputation and his legacy. Others remained silent, refusing to discuss their pasts, taking their secrets to their graves. A very few expressed genuine remorse, acknowledged their complicity, and accepted moral responsibility. These were the exceptions. Most preferred to forget, to focus on what they had built in America rather than what they had enabled in Germany. The recurring symbol through all of this is not a weapon or a piece of technology, but the paperclip itself, that small, ordinary object that held together the sanitized files. It represented bureaucratic efficiency, the ability to process human beings as paperwork, to transform moral questions into administrative procedures. The paperclip was a tool of organization, of control, of forgetting. It did not weigh the dead. It did not count the victims. It simply held papers together, neatly, cleanly, efficiently. In that sense, it was the perfect symbol for Operation Paperclip, the reduction of profound moral questions to matters of procedure, the triumph of pragmatism over principle, the choice to forget in the service of convenience. The paperclip said, "This is not about right and wrong, this is about what works." And in the calculus of the Cold War, what worked was recruiting the enemy's scientists, scrubbing their pasts, and putting them to work building the future. By 1955, more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians had been brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip and related programs. They were dispersed across the country, working at military bases, research facilities, universities, and defense contractors. Their contributions were real and significant. They accelerated American technological development by years, perhaps decades. They helped the United States maintain parity with and eventually surpass the Soviet Union in the arms race and the space race. They became professors, mentoring the next generation of American scientists. They published papers, filed patents, and received awards. They became, in effect, Americans living proof that the American experiment could absorb anyone, from anywhere, and transform them into citizens. It was a powerful narrative, one that spoke to America's self-image as a nation of immigrants, a land of second chances, but it was also a narrative built on amnesia, on the deliberate forgetting of what these men had done before they arrived, of whom they had served, of what they had enabled. The ethical compromise of Operation Paperclip raises questions that extend beyond history into philosophy. Can expertise be separated from the moral character of the expert? Should it be? If a scientist develops valuable knowledge through unethical means, is it wrong to use that knowledge? Does using it validate the methods by which it was obtained? If a person commits atrocities but later contributes to society, does the contribution redeem the atrocity, or does the atrocity taint the contribution? These are not abstract questions. They have practical implications for how societies deal with compromised individuals, for how they balance justice against pragmatism, for how they weigh the past against the future. Operation Paperclip suggests that, in practice, societies prioritize the future. The past can be minimized, reframed, forgotten, especially when the present offers compelling reasons to do so. This is both understandable and troubling. It is understandable because societies must function, must move forward, and must make use of available resources. It is troubling because it suggests that accountability is optional, that crimes can be overlooked if the criminal has something valuable to offer. In the end, the scientists of Operation Paperclip were neither heroes nor monsters, but something more complicated, ordinary men who made extraordinary compromises, who served a monstrous regime and then served its conqueror, who valued their work above moral principle, who accepted the bargain that was offered because the alternative was punishment or obscurity. They were intelligent, talented, and amoral, focused on problems to be solved rather than consequences to be considered. In this, they were not unique. They were emblematic of a broader human tendency, the compartmentalization that allows people to do terrible things while maintaining a sense of themselves as decent, rational, even virtuous. The Americans who recruited them were also ordinary pragmatic officials, who convinced themselves that the ends justified the means, that national security required moral flexibility, that the Cold War was too important to be constrained by sentiment or scruple. Both groups made choices that seemed rational at the time, that were justified by the logic of their circumstances, but that left a legacy of moral ambiguity. The story of Operation Paperclip is not a story of triumph or tragedy, but of compromise, the kind of compromise that shapes history more often than we like to acknowledge. It is a story about what happens when ideals meet reality, when the moral certainties of wartime give way to the ambiguities of peace. It is a story about the price of technological progress, about who pays and who benefits. It is a story about memory and forgetting, about how societies choose what to remember and what to erase. Most of all, it is a story about choices made by scientists who decided to serve evil, the choices made by officials who decided to employ them, the choices made by a society that decided to accept the bargain. These were human choices, made by people who had alternatives, who could have chosen differently, who did not. They chose pragmatism over principle, advantage over justice, the future over the past. Those choices built the world we live in, a world of rockets and satellites and missiles, a world where the boundaries between good and evil are less clear than we pretend, a world where the paperclip still holds the pages together, still keeps the secrets, still whispers that all can be forgiven if you have something to offer. May 17, 1945, a man in a grey suit stands before American officers and answers questions about rocket fuel. Outside, the rubble of the Third Reich bakes in the spring sun. The war is over. The bargaining has just begun. By 1955, that man and thousands like him will be Americans. Their pasts scrubbed clean, their expertise deployed in the service of a new master. They will help build missiles that can cross oceans, satellites that can see across continents, technologies that will define the second half of the 20th century. They will do this not because they believe in democracy, some do not, but because they are scientists, and scientists solve problems. The problem they solved in Germany was how to build weapons for a fascist regime. The problem they solved in America was how to build weapons for a democratic one. The weapons were different. The mindset was the same: efficiency, precision, results. The dead do not matter. The victims are forgotten. Only the work remains. And the paperclip, holding it all together, small and ordinary and necessary, a symbol of how easily evil can be filed away when it no longer serves a purpose. How quickly the past can be forgotten when the future beckons. This is the truth Operation Paperclip reveals. that redemption is not a matter of remorse or restitution, but of utility. If you can help us, we will help you forget. The bargain was offered, the bargain was accepted, and in accepting it, both sides became something other than what they claimed to be, the scientists less redeemed than reprieved, the Americans less liberators than accomplices, both bound together by a compromise that secured the future by betraying the past. The paperclip holds, the pages stay together, the story remains, waiting to be read by those willing to look, to question, to recognize that the line between hero and war criminal is sometimes nothing more than a matter of timing, of who wins, of what you can offer when the bargain is made.